I'll go back to the terminal and navigate in or stay in the recipes folder where I'm currently at. And I will generate a new component called recipe detail. This will create a new folder for me. I'll get rid of the test again, as you already know, of the CSS file as well as the styles metadata here. And now I want to configure this detail. I'll start with the HTML code. And as before, I prepared some code which I'm pasting into this file. Of course, we have to update this later on. Of course, you'll find this file or this code attached to the lecture as well. So this is my recipe detail component HTML code. And as you see, I got some string interpolation here too, referring to a selected recipe. And then, well, the various fields of that selected recipe. And of course, the selected recipe should be the one the user just clicked on in the recipe list. So in order to work with that, I'll also switch to my recipe detail component TS file here. And this file will grow later on. For now, what I want to have here is a property named selected recipe, which will be of type recipe. And I'll let my IDE add the import here for me. WebStorm, by the way, to mention that again if you're interested. So this will be the selected recipe. And later on, I will fetch this through routing and so on. But for now, why don't we fetch this through input or through a property binding? So I'll add the input metadata to the selected recipe. And I want to go to my recipe list component here to specify a click listener on this recipe item, which says on selected, and which will pass this recipe I'm currently at in the iteration. In the recipe list component, I can then add this method on selected, which will hold the selected recipe. And with that, I want to use that to update the recipe detail. Now I'm doing this here in a bit of a complicated way, and later on, as I said, we will do this in a different way, but this is a good practice for the data binding here. So that's not too bad to do it this way. So now when I click on the recipe list, this onSelected is fired, which tells me, hey, you selected this recipe here, and I want to give it to the recipe detail component. Though the recipe detail component will be a sibling to the recipe list component. And I can set this up right now because I will have the recipe detail here in the recipes component. So recipe detail. This is of course the selector set up in the recipe detail component in the recipe detail folder. So I'm using this here, and of course I have to add it to the metadata recipe detail component. Let my IDE do the import, but get rid of the second part here again, as I'm using the barrel, the index.ts file. So with that, I'm using this. If I save this and reload the page, you see this will later be the recipe detail, which allows me to edit it, add the ingredients to the shopping list. But currently we're not seeing anything here, of course, because the ingredient, or not the ingredient, the recipe to which we're binding is empty right now. So that won't work. So we know which recipe we select. We know this in the recipe list component, but we can't use it there. We have to give it to a one higher level. We have to pass it to the recipes component, which holds the recipe list and the recipe detail component. So as I said, this is not the best way. You will do this in a different way later, but for now I'll do it this way. I'll create a new event emitter in the recipe list component where which is where the selection will happen. So recipe selected will be a new event emitter. I'll import that from Angular Core. And this is a generic class which will emit a recipe at the end. So that's why I'm passing this here. And in the onSelected method here, I use this event emitter to emit an event. And of course, I emit the selected recipe. Now with that, I can go to my recipes component, to the HTML file, and listen to this custom event here, recipe selected, to then set selected recipe equal to $event, because remember, $event is the fixed name for any data transferred through an event emitted by event emitter in Angular 2 in general. So $event will refer to the selected recipe, and I'm then setting this equal to selected recipe, which is a property I have yet to create in my recipes component. Selected recipe will be of type recipe. And this now, also add the recipe import of course, this selected recipe can now be passed through property binding to my recipe detail component. However, in order to ensure that this doesn't break at the beginning, I'll add the Elvis operator, this question mark here in the recipe detail, to only try to access this if it is set. Otherwise, you would get an error. However, this still won't work because the last step I have to do, of course, is in the recipe list component, I have to make this an output. So my event emitter here has to be an output. I'll have to add the import from Angular Core as well. And with that, if we reload the application and click here, you see that this gets updated. And this is how the recipe should look later.